Hello, Brett here. Just wanted to make a quick note before we begin. I know some of you listen with small children over speakers, and this is an interview episode, and therefore we do not bleep out anything our guests say. So, not quite as clean as always. We'll be back with a normal clean one next week. You might want headphones for this one if little ones are around. Thanks. Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Douville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man super dreading the fusion of two other Prime Federation Metroid hunters.
Tim Longo.
I tried to get in like every, and maybe they're echoing corruption. I don't know. I was trying to find a way to work in every possible tie-in to the Metroid series, since you're playing so many of them right now, or have so recently played so many of them.
And I'm going to start the Game Boy. I think it's technically Metroid 2. It's called, which was the the Samus Returns remake.
Right.
Yep. So I'm going to go back and just because we have Nintendo. So, but enough about that. Yes, good intro. Thank you. We are excited. I don't even know. Did we talk about this on socials?
We have not.
Okay. Well, this is very much a surprise. Okay.
Yep.
We have a guest, everybody. We have a guest for Metroid Prime, which we were both super excited about in so many ways. I will jump into the intro that I wrote myself, so I probably got something wrong. But his name is Jack Mathews. He is a programmer, technical leader, and I believe his career started all the way back in 1995, where it looks like he was actually one of the co-owners and working on GameSpy 3D, which I think was a Quake-related thing that we'll maybe talk about later, because hopefully he can tell us some stories about that era, because Brett and I were both kind of in and around that area. It's very interesting times for us, for the games industry. With a small stint at 3D Effects working on Voodoo Tech, which I can't wait to hear about. As well as Ritual Entertainment for a small stint. And then in 2000, he joined Retro Studios, where he was there for about 8 years, I believe. He was one of the lead technical engineers on Metroid Prime 1, and as well as working on the other Prime games, before leaving in 2008. He then went on to co-found Armature Studio, which is also awesome, with two other fellows, I believe. That was 2008, of course, and then he stayed there for another 8 years. But while there, working on games like Recore and Dead Star, I'm sure among others. I don't have Armature's full catalog. And then around 2016, he left the industry for a time and was doing various things, including being a parent. I want to point out, good for him. And then now I think he's back at Blue Point. I think he did some contracting for Blue Point along the way, but then has landed back at Blue Point, maybe permanently, it sounds like, working on the remasters for Shadow of the Colossus and Dark Souls, or no, Demon Souls, that would have been. My notes have Dark Souls, but that's incorrect. And then I think he's at Blue Point today. So, Jack, thank you so much for being on. Happy to have you.
Thank you for having me, and that was all. You pretty much summarized the back half of my life, so thank you very much.
Okay.
You did it.
You did it.
Then maybe you're entirely too documented online, I guess.
Yeah,
clearly.
Google. Hey, am I right? Okay. But yeah.
Anyway, guys, this was fun. I'll talk to y'all later.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, we're here to talk about Metroid Prime. As you know, we just finished the series for the podcast, and so we'll get to that for sure. And of course, Retro, a bit of an infamous studio, and then Armature, also very cool to be a co-founder of that. So, hopefully we can hear some stories. But We talked about it in pre-show a little bit. One of the ways we definitely like to start, because we have a varied audience, is the ye old early days of Jack Mathews getting into the games industry. And in your case, it sounds, it looked like you did a lot of rendering work as well, so including 3D effects. So, yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about, the sort of, the icebreaker is how did you get into the biz and what was that like and et cetera. So the early days of Jack Mathews in games.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically I always was, I've been programming since I was like 8, and I've always been doing that as a hobbyist thing. And then when Quake 1 came out, Quake Spy, had come out, which was like the first server browser on the internet. And after it had come out, a lot of people were using it, and it was basically like this sort of archaic technology where you pretty much pointed it at a website and it would scan the website for IP addresses, and then it would use those IP addresses to find Quake servers. But it was actually funny because I remembered it when it scanned for the IP addresses, it would just like if someone changed the layout of the website at all for, the IP address list, then they'd have to update the software, and I thought it was like the dumbest thing. And so I wrote the two guys, Joe Powell and Tim Cook, not Tim Apple, but different Tim Cook. And I was like, hey, so I've got an idea. How about whenever anyone types at a website, you just look for things that look like IP addresses and then grab those. And here I wrote some code that does that. And they went, cool, want to join the project? And I'm like, yes. And that's kind of how I actually joined on to Quake Spy. Yeah. And then what happened after that is we, the three of us, had been talking to id Software because Carmack really wanted to make a version of Quake that played well on the internet. The issue with Quake is the original one was made mostly to work well over LANs, but then once it was over the internet, things kind of fell apart. So that's when Carmack decided to do QuakeWorld, and he wanted to make Quake Spy the server browser for QuakeWorld. Like, he didn't want to write his own, so he just sort of came to us and said, hey, you guys have cool software. Why don't you just be the official server browser of QuakeWorld? Like he opened up the specification. Anyone could write a server browser, but he worked directly with us to make a decent interface. Or, well, I mean, it's Carmack. He made a decent interface and then told us to use it and how to use it. But that's totally fine. And so, after that, and after I was kind of acquainted with them, then, and I was working on QuakeWorld, I'd met Zoid, who had been working on Capture the Flag with Quake, and I'd just known him through community stuff. And, John was moving on to Quake 2, and so he wanted to have QuakeWorld be maintained, but he didn't want anyone to have to do it. So he actually gave the project to me and Zoid. And then also I just inherited GL Quake, which was the 3D accelerator version of Quake running under OpenGL. I don't even know how I officially got it. I think it was just kind of like John was. Oh, I remember. It's because QuakeWorld, we were integrating GL Quake with QuakeWorld as well. So the whole thing kind of became one project. And so I just decided, okay, cool, 3D graphics, this is fun. And from there, I had been working with some folks at 3DFX, Gary McTaggart and Charlie Brown over there. And at one point, they were ready to move on and go to, I believe, Valve. No. I think they might have been going to Ritual, actually. I don't remember. I kept following them around. And so they were like, hey, do you want a job in the Voodoo porting group at 3DFX, which is basically a group that is, that helps get stuff onto 3DFX hardware. And I'm like, sure. I was like 2 years in college at this point. I was pretty much about to fail out. I believe I had actually transferred to a community college without telling my parents because I was just bored by anything else but coding. And so when this opportunity came and the money was more than I thought I'd make graduating, I jumped at it and moved out to California and started at 3DFX.
Wow. It's so crazy too, because you're mentioning all of these services and, seeing Quake 3D accelerated. And it's like, I had just started at LucasArts at that time, and we were playing on the LAN quite a bit, but also going home and trying to play as well. And it's just the world is so small.
Yeah. I played GeoQuake on SGI machines, right? I mean, there was a port to the Irish machines that where I was.
Oh yeah, because I think that was the first one actually. Yeah. I mean, I basically maintained the 3DFX OpenGL driver, which was. I mean, it was really kind of a joke because it was basically a GLQuake driver. Like we literally just wrote stuff. And then actually I maintained GLQuake well into my time at 3DFX until someone at Power VR noticed and went to id and they're like, why are you letting our competitor write the driver, write the game?
Right.
And and then that's when I had to let it go. Yeah.
It was,
a Wild West.
I was literally going to say the same thing. It was a strange time where that was all very kind of not vague, but it was Wild West at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I remember those times as like being at devs and just the stuff that would happen at dev studios and the decisions that got made. And like nowadays there'd be 5 lawyers in between you and any of these decisions telling you not to do it. But I mean, it was basically just a bunch of kids behaving like kids with disposable income. It was crazy.
Yeah. And I still remember getting my first Voodoo card too. That's when I saw it, and when I was doing research on you and I saw that, it's just this nostalgia, comes with the first 3D acceleration. Both Quake was a big memory for me, and then Tomb Raider, we've talked about on the podcast before too. Seeing that on a Voodoo card too was just like magical moments of game development, or as a user, really. I mean, even though I was getting into games at the time, as a user, still just such great time, weird great time. But like you said, like very, for better or for worse, professionalism was maybe there and not so much there. But So then, is Ritual worth mentioning, or just kind of move into retro, or how long were you there at 3DFX? And then
I was at 3DFX. I think it was like a year and a half that I was there. It felt like longer. I mean, I was only 20, and so it felt like forever. I mean, it was my first real job and moving out. And then after that, I believe Gary and Charlie went to Ritual, and then I left 3DFX to basically go to Ritual when they were leaving, I think. And I was there about a year, and that was fun because that was getting into like the Dallas game dev scene, which I was on the periphery of there at id, but being in it and seeing like the slow implosion that was Ion Storm, and being at Ritual and working on stuff. And then I was there about a year, and then tried to flit about back and forth, starting a few ventures and things like that before Zoid, who again I'd worked with on QuakeWorld, basically just told me about that he was going to be starting at a place called Retro, which was a Nintendo studio. No one had ever heard of it back then. And he's just like, it's in Austin, Texas. Come on out here. And I interviewed, and it was this nutballs place with then like 120 people. I think there was like a couple of people I remembered from Ritual there, but it was so secretive and hush hush. And it just seemed like a cool place to be in a fun new adventure. And working for Nintendo, I mean, it wasn't Nintendo back then, but it was adjacent enough to Nintendo to be Nintendo, was really cool. So I decided to just take that leap and move to Austin.
And so you mentioned it being a Nintendo studio when it was pitched to you, but also being adjacent. Like, what was that? What was that relationship like? Or coming in? I mean, we had we did some amount of research on Prime specifically, and about some of what Retro was doing at the time. I guess multiple projects, and hopefully you can talk some about the engine too, specifically because we know that it sounds like Nintendo was sort of assessing things and kind of trying to see what could be used, and then Prime kind of came out of that. But what was, like, when you say Nintendo Studio, what did that mean to you when you got there?
When I got there, I knew that basically it was a studio that was funded by Nintendo of America to make for GameCube launch games. So when I say it was a Nintendo studio, I always thought of myself as working for Nintendo, but we never really dealt with Japan meaningfully except when they came out every so often. So I guess for me, it was an interesting job because it would be my first time working on console stuff, and I'd never really jumped down into that before. So that was really, really interesting to me. So the way I saw it was basically, they're trying to, I mean, it was almost pitched as, trying to do a North American version of Rare, was what a lot of people were kind of saying back then about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, the game we played prior to this was GoldenEye, so that's we're definitely.
And we had somebody from Rare on, so
we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
What was it? So, what was that transition like for you? You had been working with, a standard, before that, or a couple standards really, because 3DFX kind of had its own. They kind of set the standard to some degree for what rendering drivers look like at the time. And then, of course, you had OpenGL, which was like this. Mostly by Silicon Graphics, although it was a consortium already dealing with that. And then you go to the GameCube. What is that transition like for you? I'm curious because, my first game was on the PS2. It started as a PC project. Only PC programmers working on it. And then we're all dumped into the console waters. Super interesting, but a lot of lessons to learn in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually, what's funny is the original GameCube hardware. Well, original, I mean, it's the Wii hardware, the Wii U hardware. It's all the same, but the GameCube hardware, graphics-wise, was actually strikingly similar to the final piece of hardware 3DFX was working on as I left. It was a piece of hardware called Rampage, and it was pretty similar to that in terms of 3DFX had this thing called TMUs, 2 texture memory units that let Quake do fast light mapping on Voodoo 2, blah, blah, blah. The GameCube pretty much had 8 of those. And they were implemented the way that they were going to implement them on Rampage as what was called virtual TMUs, which was, I mean, I'm getting into the rendering weeds here, but it's also called register combiners on NVIDIA hardware. So it was pretty similar to that. And the API on the GameCube was actually really similar to the Glide API from 3DFX.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because I remember 3DFX as all their functions started with GL,
right.
Not GL, GR, for
right.
Glide Render or whatever, I think, or GX, whatever. And then, on GameCube, it was GX. But also just sort of the way that all that code was structured and the way you set everything up and sent it down the pipe was very, very, very similar. So it actually didn't feel that different to me. Probably the biggest part of the transition was that actually when I got there, Retro had already been sort of building this big engine or this idea of an engine. And so they had this gigantic set of libraries kind of already built. Not for graphics so much, but just for general file system, math, everything like that.
Sure.
And so getting the graphics stuff just kind of up and going was actually not that hard. Going into a big company after being in a small place like Ritual was actually probably the bigger adjustment period.
Right.
Yeah, you can imagine because you were following around, a couple people you knew besides, right? I mean, you had long-standing relationships, small groups, and then you go into. I mean, it was 4 teams more or less, I guess, because there were 4 launch titles. But I mean, I imagine the engineering must have been a lot of shared work and things like that. You're talking about libraries that you're working with there. Yeah,
I mean, to put it bluntly, I mean, it was just an absolute mess. There were basically 4 game teams and sort of 1 T&T or tools and technology team, but there weren't really 4 games there. They were designed. There were a lot of showing Maya mock-ups in meetings and stuff like that. But when it came down to the nuts and bolts of actually getting games up and running, there wasn't a lot of meat there. But there was there was so much engine code written for not seeing anything on screen as a result. And so that was difficult. And me and a few other people, like Andy O'Neill, Zoid, other people that thrived, we kind of just looked at everything that was there as like a hint and then just sort of did what we needed to do to get games up and running. But before that, I mean, it was odd because, I mean, Retro had, I guess, been a thing for like almost 2 years prior to that, but there was nothing on screen running for any of the games. It was bonkers.
Oh, wow. That's wild. I mean,
Yeah,
a demo is worth 1,000 design documents.
I remember when I got there, one of the people I'd known from Ritual, who's an artist, was there, and I went into his office and I saw him for the RPG project for Ravenblade. He was building out hexagonal sections of the world, and I'm like, "Oh, cool! Did the engineers tell you to build it out in this hex grid for building out the world?" And he's like, "I don't know. I'm just building what I think makes sense. No one has told me anything." It was absolutely crazy.
And it's in there. The maps are all the hexagons.
No. I'm talking about for Ravenblade. No.
Okay.
That's the sad part. Everything he did is just lost to the sands of canceled project. Yeah, it's nuts.
That is hard.
So what was the, I mean, yeah, as the sum of the, I'm sure this is through interviews and sort of oral history over time, but as you said, messy, 4 projects, it comes down to Prime, or at some point, Nintendo comes in to help guide that, and using one of these games, we're piecing things together again, using one of these games, it sort of, Nintendo suggests it becomes a Prime or a Metroid game, or a first-person game, or like what was the order of operation there?
Yeah, so basically there were 4 games. There was a football game, like American football, that was supposed to launch. There was RPG, Ravenblade. There's car combat, and then there was what was called MetaForce, which was basically a sort of third person. I believe it was third person. A third person might have been first. I don't know, but it was a shooter, basically. And the plot was nuts. Like these you're playing as aliens. Each of the worlds was going to have different crazy gravity things, but it was basically a sci-fi shooter. And so I wasn't directly involved in any of this, but the stories go that, Miyamoto basically saw that there was a sci-fi shooter and had been hearing every time he came to the United States, people would ask about Metroid on the N64, and no one in Japan cared about Metroid. So it was always striking to him every time he came to North America that people would be like, "Where's the new Metroid game?" So he sort of made the decision, looking at the design of the game, to say, well, also, Retro was formed by Jeff Spangenberg, who started Iguana, who were the makers of Turok Dinosaur Hunter, which was a successful first-person game on the N64. So
Right.
This wasn't so much of a leap. So basically, he's just like, okay, you guys are a studio of, first-person shooter console veteran success. We have this IP that North Americans seem to care about more than anything else. North Americans love shooters. Why not make Metroid a first-person shooter and turn MetaForce into that? There's almost no resemblance between MetaForce and Metroid at all. I mean, everything was pretty much scrapped, redone, then scrapped again, and then redone. But yeah, so what happened is right as the Metroid thing was happening, and I remember, Super Metroid's like my favorite console game of all time. So soon after that happened, basically the NFL game got canceled because they determined it wasn't going to be done in time for the season, and Madden just owns everything. So Nintendo got rid of that. And then Miyamoto didn't get why car combat would be interesting, because it's basically Twisted Metal. And so what ended up happening is the football team largely got merged onto Ravenblade, and the car combat team got merged onto Metroid. And then so 4 teams became 2. And then later on after that, two teams became one, and some people were brought over, a lot of engineering mostly, from Raven Blade over to Metroid. And so it's this like kind of really sad and weird double culling of the staff where it's almost like a psychopath's dream of just cream of the crop cut in half, cream of the crop cut in half, keep try to retain as much talent between those two cuts, and you end up with a really great group of people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, we talked at LucasArts, which had was maybe a little bit bigger internally, but not loads bigger internally, maybe about 150 people. But we would say, we've got enough engineers here at this company to make one really good game, and it just felt like we were spread very thin, and that the best talents in the group, it was like you might have one or two or three good engineers on any individual team, but then, they were spread out, and being able to communicate between those, and everybody's making different games and often different engines, and it could be a huge mess. There was not a lot of shared technology because that, which was strange given LucasArts history, but that kind of fell away when we moved to 3D. So it was a weird time. Stuff like that could happen, and then it happened again at the end of my tenure at LucasArts when they re-squashed down. They basically took that to heart and said, let's be one team or maybe two teams moving forward.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you explained the harsh reality of those moments. Yeah, sometimes for sure.
And so, even before those combinations happened, like the Metroid team, us on Metroid and Car Combat actually did work together a lot and tried to go for the shared thing. Football and RPG kind of did their own thing. And so when they got combined, it probably wasn't the best marriage, sports team mixed with fantasy RPG, but with us on Metroid and with Car Combat, we kind of just like really melded very well. Like Zoid was actually on Car Combat and I was on Metroid, and then Andy O'Neill had been on Car Combat, and so we just sort of jumped in and plowed forward on getting Metroid going.
So scoop here. There was a vehicular section of Metroid Prime.
No. Well, I was going to ask, I mean, as you say, you got that going. I mean, it's a, any big project is like eating an elephant, right? But you have to do it one bite at a time. So where did you start eating the elephant on Metroid Prime?
Where did I start eating? Man, hold on. Let me follow this metaphor path.
I mean, you sit down on day one of Metroid Prime. What do you do first?
Streaming. So, actually so there were only a few of us. We actually had Steve Bond from Valve on the team. Got a fellow named Steve McRae, who's, I believe, still at Armature. Matt Kimberling, Akintunde Amatowoju, me, and Frank LaFuente. And so what we kind of did is we looked at what are sort of the things about Metroid. One was seamless loading. You go through the doors basically.
Right.
And so the idea was the seamless loading. Now GameCube actually had a really, really good architecture, if you did it right, for background seamless loading, like everything loaded off the disk without CPU involvement. And if you did your data right, then you could basically just load things into memory, use it immediately, and not even like touch it. And so
that's very similar to the N64s, actually, I think, as well.
That was right. That's their idea. Is basically the N64 had a really good DMA engine, and so with the GameCube, they sort of designed the same thing. They made it so that the disk controller had direct access to the memory without needing to go through the CPU for anything. Nice. So again, so like for instance, if you baked out all your textures on disk in the exact same format that the hardware used them, then you could just load them from disk. Once the load is done, just point the hardware at that memory. You didn't have to reformat it or anything at all. So I remember one of our first test comprised of basically a third-person model going between 3 different rooms, like a sand room, fire, and ice room, and seamlessly going through them. You know, like opening a door, going through, closing the door. And it was third person on purpose that you'd see the rooms, you know, loading and unloading in front of you and behind you. So that was like test 1. Test 2, Akeen's side, he did like basically a rudimentary particle system and like rudimentary weapons. So like getting, you know, some stuff shooting. And then on the AI side, and most of this happened after we went first person, and Akeen took that over. The first thing with the AIs was actually to do a patterned AI. So that was another thing about Metroid. It's outside of like the space pirates, you know, all of the little guys running around, the critters are, you know, running around largely on patterns. Mm-hmm. And so I believe it was Frank Lafuente had the idea of basically making it so that we could script up waypoints and do the patterned AIs. And we started with the beetle. So the beetle that's in Chozo Ruins was actually the first AI written for the game. And, you know, we did like a lot of things with him. Like we set up patterns out of waypoints, but then that ended up going away and we just started doing things more algorithmically. Like, you know, we had it so that like the reason they like buried themselves and came back up was actually so that we could dynamically modify how many were on screen at once, depending on performance. You know, all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah. Smoke and mirror stuff.
Oh, that's a great example.
We love it.
Yeah. So those were the 3 attacks, because prior to that, like, so prior to getting Metroid and going, like basically, I'd been on the tools and technology team, and there was a lot of us doing a lot of different tools and tech. And like I said, we didn't really have meaningful game designs to go after. And I remembered, we needed a world editor. We needed a way to like place objects in the world. And I remember we had this, like, it was one of the worst meetings of my life. We were like in this big room and everyone was like designing, what are we going to do for the world editor? And like, and like all these people were just describing like the worst like C++ trivia you ever heard. And I remembered the point where I finally checked out of the meeting was when we were trying to name what like an actor with a transform would be called. And someone said, we should call them ducks. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, a duck, you know, a duck. And I'm like, all right, I'm out. And so then they started, this was mostly the RPG team.
This is the worst meeting of my life when I wasn't even there.
Yeah. And so they wrote the world editor. And then like the day after I started what I actually called what we shipped as World Editor 2, before World Editor 1 was even started. And that's what we ended up using for Metroid. So by the time we actually like were going on Metroid, we actually already had a world editor and we had a pipeline for like placing objects and, you know, having properties on them and stuff like that. So that was actually, normally you'd sort of have to kind of attack that in the middle of a project, or you hope you inherit one from a prior project. But as a new studio, we were lucky that everyone was twiddling their thumbs for so long that we could have this sort of deep deck of stuff already written. Like we actually had like some stream loading stuff and some other pieces. So really, that's what gave us the little bump of a head start that you wouldn't normally have had back then. Because back then, especially, I mean, unless you were like, even if you were on Unreal, it would still be just a Herculean effort to get like background streaming and stuff like that in. But yeah, that's what we bit off first.
Yeah, that is indicative of a divide among programmers, I would say. You know, there's the group. I mean, one of the things with tools and technology groups that's a real risk is if you're not building for a specific project, it's really easy to get way up your own behind about what you're making. And that's where you end up with somebody saying, well, call things ducks, because they don't stop to think how impossible it will be for the people on the team to actually talk and reason about what the heck they're doing, you know, versus sitting down and actually building something practical that you need. Yeah, I can remember I've had a flashback to the worst C++ meeting of my life. So thanks for that.
You're welcome. I'm glad to bring up trauma for everyone involved.
You know, this was when I was in grad school, but I was dealing with a contractor, and they had 7 managers on our project and 1 coder.
Uh-oh.
And that coder hadn't had no experience with C++, so we had a whole meeting where he described like a color class that he wrote, and I'm like, oh my god, like, and I couldn't leave. This was anyway, it was in academia. So like the company that got all the money is the one that had 7 managers and one coder, and the educational facility, of course, got next to nothing. That's a tale for another day. But boy, what a long meeting that was.
So I want to pull on a couple threads there. You mentioned that Super Metroid is your favorite console game.
Mm-hmm.
And
good taste. Yes,
you very, very good. Yep, we played that on the podcast as well. Years ago, maybe at this point, I don't know. How I love hearing the considerations that you specifically were calling out with the first kind of steps you were taking to build the game, and also kind of combined with, so essentially being yourself at least, and I'd love to hear if there's other examples, but yourself being a Metroid fan, but then also this combination of Western's, desire for Metroid versus, and then Miyamoto specifically, and we've heard this before actually, that there is a divide there. But like how faithful / excited, I don't know, like what was the team when you got Metroid and you started to say, okay, we have to now make a new, because one of the craziest things about this game is the translation to a different genre.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things you just mentioned about AI being pattern recognition, as opposed to say something like another game of the era, like whatever Halo or blah, 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 it's like more algorithmic, as you said, AI based. What was it like for the team to kind of go through that process? Were you one of the only fans, or were there many fans, or how did you deconstruct otherwise? I'm really interested to hear more about that.
I was not one of the only fans. A lot of us, God, I can't say only fans on a podcast. Anyway, I was not one of the only fans. There were a lot of us. I was definitely vocal. I remember when Jeff Spangenberg came in to tell me I'd be working on Metroid, we had this ridiculous, like, no real walls at Retro, and I just went, holy fucking shit, I'm working on Metroid. And he's like, shut up, I haven't told everyone yet. And so but no, there was a lot of us, but I remembered there was a lot of heated arguments. Many of us were fans of the game. A lot of us couldn't get over the first person thing. I remember a lot of people wanted to fight tooth and nail to try to do third person. And actually we were like going to, I believe that's why our demo might have been a little third person walk around thing at first, was because people were still trying to fight for it. I remember, I think it was Spangenberg that said to me, like, well, if they don't want our Metroid, we'll just make it third person and call it Retroid. And, and that was, that, so like a lot of people were really trying to fight for that. I remembered, Mark HH, you guys know him.
Yes, yeah.
The late great Mark HH. He was having a particularly hard time with the morph ball because what was it? It was another game that had come out around then. I think it might have been Conker's Bad Fur Day, where they had like, it was a rare game where they had like a lot of contextual situations where you'd like stand on a plate and then you could do stuff, like your character would stand somewhere and that would let them transform or do something different. And, I remember he was like thinking like, so how are we going to do this? Are you going to like step on a plate, then you become a ball? And everyone in the room just balked, is like, no. And he's like, wait, this is impossible. We're doing a third person and a first person. And then, and then he did the impossible. But yeah, like it was very hard. Like I said, at first everyone sort of bucked against doing the first person. Then once we embraced the first person, then it just became, okay, how do we get accessibility in here? And, there wasn't much of a template for us to go off of during most of development because, I listened to your first couple episodes on this series and basically, the controls, I mean, you try to do the controls now and your hand will just fall off. It's awful, but the C-stick on the original GameCube was terrible, and Nintendo was very adamant and probably right. They're like, don't do dual analog. Like, this C-stick is awful, and I believe it's even one of those where if it gets overused, it gets looser over time.
Yeah,
you know,
it wears down for sure.
Yeah. And so there was a real, they were just like, look, this is basically an 8-way D-pad. It's not a reasonable stick. So we sort of had to work within those limitations as well. But yeah, so once it became first person, then it all became, how do we get this to be accessible? You know, we didn't want to emulate keyboard and mouse. We wanted to make it feel empowering to jump around, and we wanted to be able to have verticality. And that was it. So yeah, everyone was a fan, and everyone just jumped on board to tackle whatever challenge was put in front of us.
One of those challenges was maintaining 60,
Yep.
which is extraordinary that you would target that at the time. I mean, I never did in that era, although I'm a person who doesn't often feel, or I certainly don't see the difference. I'm a 30 hertz brain, I guess. My visual processing doesn't see 60 really, but I gather you can feel it. So maybe I feel it. I don't know, but those games are silky smooth to play. So kudos. That must have been, I mean, on a later project, we said, well, if we're going to be 60, we have to be 60 today, and we have to stay there. How did you approach it?
Well, for one, it was, we have to be 60 and we have to stay there was definitely a big part of it. The other part of it was I tried to, I think it was Micah Brash that once talked about, that you just need to optimize for the worst case. Like if you're constantly trying to find all these little micro optimization places, then you're going to have like a hitchy experience in your game. And so what I really did first is I looked at the GameCube hardware, I looked at all its pieces, and I really looked at how the performance would work on it. And so what I actually found were 2 performance traps in the GameCube hardware that I avoided like the plague. One was specular lighting, and the other was bump mapping. Both of those things destroyed specular would destroy your per vertex performance, and bump mapping just destroyed everything, to be honest. And so once I did that, then what really remained was essentially everything on the screen would render pretty similar set of materials. So I would just use almost the exact same number of texture passes everywhere in the game. So this is just for the main combat visor. And then what was nice is if you just used diffuse lighting on the GameCube and not anything else, and you just kept it to like 4 diffuse lights, 4 dynamic lights, it was basically free. I mean, it cost almost nothing as long as you didn't go into specular or bump mapping. And then in terms of, like the actual static lighting, we just used light map stuff. Andy O'Neill actually wrote all of that. Me and Zoid, it was funny, we kind of walked him through what Quake 2 and Quake 3 were doing, and Andy pretty much emulated that and did the same kind of thing for static lighting. So what you ended up with really was, for the world, almost every area didn't really differ that much. And GameCube had a really good pipeline. The 3FX did this as well, where the vertex pipeline and the fill pipeline were pretty distinct from each other, and there was so much available memory bandwidth on the GameCube that it was really hard to choke one or the other with each other. So essentially, as long as you were kind of giving it, feeding it the sane amounts of data, you weren't going to have all these like weird hidden costs. Like that's what the PlayStation 3 was rife with. You would you put things in the wrong kind of memory or put it around, and you're like constantly rearranging. You just didn't have that with the GameCube. So we really lucked out on that. So once you had that with the world, and we literally had like a little GPU meter that would just show where you were at, then you just had to make sure that combat and particles stayed in budget. And I mean, sometimes you have crazy technology solutions for trying to fix this, and other times you just beat people with reeds until they do the right thing. And so I opted for the latter. And so like literally we just had all sorts of like flashing on the screen when you went over on frame rate, making it very obvious, having it be test failures. And then we just sort of beat it into everybody that this was what the minimum was going to be, and your work wasn't done, and QA would fail you if you weren't keeping within the limits that we set. And so if environment kept within their limits and then things were going too much on gameplay wise, then it became either remove some enemies, scale down on particles, or make some kind of deal with environment to make the environment handle this. So that's kind of where we sort of started with 60. And then we have the 4 visors in the game. And what I did with that is pretty much as I was designing the other visors, I very intentionally made it so that any new feature added to a visor removed something else. Like, for instance, in the thermal visor, it does not do world lighting underneath. So we turn off light maps. So I get an extra texture pass because I remove a texture pass.
I see. I figured you were going to say something like that because the visors would allow you to make big choices like that.
Yeah, or like the scan visor, we put the gun down whenever you engage the visor. So suddenly you're no longer rendering any particles or any gunfire. So we don't have to worry about that entering the scene. X-ray visor.
Such good trade-offs.
Yeah, X-ray visor was a similar one. And also X-ray visor has this it has hardware fog that comes in really far, so we can actually bring the far clip plane really far in on the X-ray visor as well. Stuff like that. So and I just was really diligent about basically going through areas in the game, switching between the visors, looking at the GPU meter, and making sure that assumption held throughout. So yeah.
Well, standards are not so much what you say; they're what you accept, and it sounds like you accepted a high bar only. That's really a great approach. So, thank you for doing it. I appreciate it.
Well, the artist didn't, but I'm glad you did.
Well, I think you obviously I'm repeating what you said a little bit, but the one time I was involved with a 60 frame game, it was really kind of a cultural thing, right? It was, it was something that had to be ingrained as everyone worked for it to work. And in our case, it was like a sequel. So it was, a different proposition in some fundamental ways, but still I love your description of, flashing things on screen, making it part of QA. There's definitely, like you said, wizardry that could happen, but changing people's mentality can often be much more powerful anyway. The result is,
I can't think of a way to get a consistent 60 just by engineering magic. It's literally impossible because, I don't remember who said it, but software is a gas that will expand to fill the available space. So you unless you limit that space early and fast, there is no amount of technical wizardry you can do to fight the onslaught of content unless you limit the content and you do it. It's wet works. It's people. It's not technology a lot of the time.
Yeah. It's all about, choosing the right constraints, right? And you chose some good ones, right? How was that? Did you do tests that kind of determined that was, that was really poor performance, or did Nintendo already know and just kind of say, hey, this will be bad?
It was documented, but I still tested it. They actually have really good documentation of how many clocks something would be bad or whatever. But it was also very, very easy to test. With bump mapping, to be honest, I went through some of their own tech demos and then just did perf things, and it was it was completely obvious just looking at their own GPU meters when you turned on the feature how bad it was.
Specular.
That's a great way to do it. Yeah, specular was surprising in how bad that was too. But yeah, I just emulated that. Anything that looks shiny in Metroid, it's actually this it's so bad. It's this dumb texture map that is almost looks like water caustics, and I just use the normals to map to the texture so that it always is moving as something rotates in space, and it's just adding that and multiplying by one of the lights, so it looks like it's specular and shiny, but really it's just an extra texture pass that's just indexing based on the rotation.
Just brightening some stuff up.
Pretty much.
Nice. Yeah. It's a great cheat.
Yeah, yeah, those are the gems that people get creative about. Oh, that's amazing. I mean, I only understand half of what the two of you are saying anyway, but that sounds that's awesome.
Well, I'm glad half of it's impressive.
But as engineers, we'll never tell you which half. So
yeah, no, I understand. I've known that for years. Yeah, I just roll with it. Yeah, I mean there's it's a single platform game, so there's you've been talking a lot about the system itself, which I think is really telling and cool, and I'm always
very Nintendo
jealous of. yeah. I don't have I mean it's like barely ever worked on a single platform game, so that's really I don't know. There's just as you're describing working with the pipelines and everything you discovered about the system, it's just cool to see somebody take everything they can out of something and know it's backwards and forwards to be able to manipulate it in the way you need it to. So
I mean, it was definitely a blessing to be able to do that. Like it was, when I was at Armature, we didn't have that opportunity a lot, and it definitely is frustrating not being able to do that. It's definitely a gift to be able to like just have one platform you're locked into and just know everything possible about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And your point about how when it came to, I guess rendering passes, I don't know if that's the right term, but you mentioned consistency and how, there wasn't like specific tricks that had to be employed in different places and such. It just jogged my memory that one of my notes that I wrote down a lot for the game is that it's a very, and this is definitely it takes a village thing because it has to do with content as well as tech, but it's just a very consistent game, and it helps obviously to be on one platform, but more than a lot of games, I feel like it just was so evenly distributed as far as its execution, and the way you were describing how you were able to maintain that, and how obviously the artists and designers and audio and everybody have to abide by that. It doesn't surprise me now how consistent it really was, because it's just from top to bottom, beginning to end, it's just a really stellar game in that way. And not only did it trailblaze in this weird, progression from a 2D game to a 3D first person game, but I think from a polish standpoint, so I wanted to ask you about polish and if there's any topics to talk about there, because I feel like it is as far as games, as a game developer, that I would put high on my list for a game that is very well polished, which is a very hard thing to do, in my opinion. It's just so darn polished. And I don't know if that's the Nintendo magic or retro magic or what it is, but that consistency is the word that I just kept coming back to. And for a game of that size to be that consistent, it just kind of boggles my mind.
Honestly, it boggles my mind too. Like our design staff was just, I mean, everyone we had on the game was so good, and the designers, all of them, Jason Bear, Carl Deckard, Mark Pacini, Wiccan, like they all just really wanted to push everything. I think one of the things that helped with polish was that we had a system, a game system, and an authoring system. We never went with scripting. We never let them do anything crazy. We did not have a text. We did not have a text scripting system. We had a series of. I mean, it's a very primitive version of what almost looks like Blueprint nowadays, of basically connecting things based on messages and events. And I think through that limitation, it forced them to sort of, Lincoln log the whole game together and piece the whole game together in a very intentional way, and in a way that's hard to break, because, I mean, you guys have probably both seen it when people go just crazy on scripting, and when designers start scripting all over the place, particularly it's the absolute worst, and you end up with so many bugs.
I'm looking the other way right now. Over.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had a case at right around this time at LucasArts, would have been like 99 maybe, where they had a text-based scripting language for Sith, which, Tim, I think you were on Sith, right? Mysteries of the Sith?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody wrote like a camera switching system in script. that was like 3 printed pages of script that the guy found impossible to maintain, and a programmer took it and said, "Oh, I see what you're trying to do here," and wrote it in 3 lines.
Right.
And it's because we just think differently.
Yeah.
We have a different tool set, and having that kind of constraint where you can only do that, I think is a hugely powerful thing.
Yeah, like at Nintendo, even, like, it was crazy because I think we were looking at one of the Zelda games or something. They wanted to see how our tools worked, and they were showing us some of theirs, and it was nuts because like their designers were doing. I mean, they call most of their designers just planners. They don't even call them like game designers. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty much just editing CSV files. They were editing Excel spreadsheets, and that's how they were modifying data in the game. Like, they didn't have tools. They didn't have, but that limit meant that they knew where the boundaries were, because I mean, this is something I've said for a while, and it's not the most delicate thing, but I think like a lot of the times here in the West, the role of a game designer is either a bad engineer or a bad artist. Like we sort of throw them at the other disciplines of scripting or kit bashing art together into levels in a way that doesn't necessarily serve the end product very well. Mm. And so one thing that, we definitely did like a lot of scripting by way of the sort of Lincoln logging together at Retro, but in another way, everyone kind of like knew where they fit in the team and knew what they were meant to do. The game designers were there to architect the worlds, meaning they like built out, all of the, what we call blue rooms, what everyone calls gray boxes now. They built all that out for the motion and for the feel and making sure that like basically they could get good gameplay in a room. And then they Lincoln logged all that gameplay together, and artists built all the art to make it look beautiful around it. And everyone and game designers were not like building AIs, and they weren't like building state machines, and they weren't putting all these things together that were essentially logic puzzles that would end up biting us at the end. And so I think that might have helped in focusing everybody to being able to do a really good polish stage at the end.
That, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but as you started to describe the constraints you were talking about and sort of, I don't know, the more, component or systems or object orientedness of it, I was here in my office here having a moment because you nailed it on the head. Like, it's so, as a designer, I was never a good scripter. I don't like scripting.
Can confirm.
You're totally right. And to the way you describe it, and I don't know if you were working this theory out on the fly as you were answering the question, or if you've answered this question before, but I can totally see that. As a designer, I can see in the game those constraints, like the room. You go room by room in this game, and your rule set is there. Like, you feel the world feels cohesive and consistent, like I was mentioning earlier, because of these constraints. And that, if you think of Metroid, Super Metroid, it's component-based, pattern-based, sections put together in things that give the player an understanding of what they can and can't do, and when they can do something and when they can't. And it just, like, whether you happened into it or not, I just think it's a revelation to give those constraints to designers, because they need them. We need them. And the game feels like a Metroid game, but it shouldn't. It shouldn't. And I just think it's, I don't know. I had a moment, so I'm just sharing that.
Well, we're getting up in an hour, and we've given Tim a crisis of faith. So
I'm rethinking it all.
Might be time for us to start hearing a little bit about your more recent work. Give you a chance to plug anything you've been working on. I want to hear a little bit about this business of your wife's as well, because I did go check it out today. And it's funny because in some interview I read, it said, I've temporarily retired to go do that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the recent stuff you've been doing?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I most recently I've been working at Blue Point Games. After I left Armature, I I did a contracting stint there. Then I worked with some folks for about a year trying to get a game off the ground. Then had a kid, and then a few months into that, went back to Blue Point part-time, which is what I'm doing right now. But separately from that, as near the end of my stint with Armature, well, actually back in 2011, my wife stopped her business. She had been a graphic designer and had a really successful business and did not like the clients anymore and did not like doing client work, and decided to start a food blog, which back then was still pretty new. Yeah. But fast forward to now, and it's really successful. She just put out her third cookbook, and
what?
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
It looks really good too.
Oh no,
I cook a lot, so I definitely was paging through. Like, oh, well, I should probably do some research on her husband, but here I am on this blog.
I get that a lot. She is definitely more of a big deal than I am now, and I couldn't be happier about it. But yeah, so she just put out her third cookbook that I'm going to plug, which is called her blog and books are called Love and Lemons, and the newest cookbook is called Love and Lemons: Simple Feel Good Food. And I think it's doing really well, and I think the price is down to like $21 right now on Amazon. I definitely recommend getting the hardcover. It is stunningly beautifully designed. My wife is a fantastic graphic designer, and her best friend is a different fantastic graphic designer, and they worked on this and really, I mean, all of her books are incredible.
That's one thing a lot of cookbooks for sure lack, I can say, as a guy with a shelf of them. So yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, she basically
how cool she could do both.
Yeah. Well, I mean, she basically, that was the goal, is to get with a publisher that would let her do that, because it was just a very important thing. But also her food is just ridiculously good.
You're so lucky.
I am very, very, very lucky. Yeah. So that is what I will plug, because I don't really have much of anything else to plug.
Okay.
But yeah. Read her book, and then I guess play God of War Ragnarok, which Blue Point helped with. And even though I didn't, my son's name is in the credits, so that's fun.
There you go.
Yeah.
Nice.
Production babies.
Darn right.
Well, Blue Point is now Sony Studio, right?
That is correct. Yep.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they've gotten absorbed into the fold.
And I mean, amazing remasters. As far as, I mean, they're cream of the crop when it comes to those games they've been putting out. But I'm sure they're up to a bunch of other cool things in the future too. But it's awesome.
Very likely. But I have no idea. I have no idea. I am not allowed to say anything.
Yeah, I'm sure.
No. I wasn't fishing.
Yeah, we're not fishing.
I would never.
But maybe after. Anyway, Jack, this has been a pleasure. It's so great to hear these stories, to get a sense of it, and talking to you, just definitely getting a sense of how the engineering team was led, which is useful to me for sure. Sadly, it was when my boss was on the line, so now he's going to be, why can't you be more like Jack?
Oh boy. Okay.
So here we go.
I need a job.
Thanks so much. It's been a genuine pleasure, and thanks again for the game.
Thank you guys very much. I'm really happy you enjoyed it. I've enjoyed listening to you guys play through it, and it's definitely been fun talking to a bunch of grizzled old vets about this.
Welcome back from the break. I feel so grateful that you found an engineer for me to talk to for.
Just happened to be Jack. Yeah, small industry, I guess. And one thing leads. Thank you to Kynan for the introduction. I met him while working on Halo, and he was he worked on. Kynan was a designer who worked from Metroid Prime 2 onward. So
I
he
see.
didn't work on one. Otherwise, I would have had him on. But
Gotcha.
he knew Jack and said Jack would be a great guest. So
Yeah, and he was. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's rare that I get to talk to an engineer who's, at my level, started at the same time, programming since he was 8, and that I haven't worked with, right? Because I tend to talk to people I've worked with in the past when I do catch up with other engineers. So it's just really, really nice to have somebody, and he worked in all kinds of different things that I didn't work on at the time, right? So like, directly working on those early hardware for 3D acceleration on the PC, and which is not something we worried about, with our games at LucasArts, because by the time we were shipping Republic Commando, it was already DirectX, right? And there was no OpenGL, and the hardware was abstracted and things like that, for the most part. And so it's just, I don't know, it's just refreshing to talk to somebody who worked on that and then worked on different hardware than I did. And I could definitely feel sharing some viewpoints,
I'd say,
about some things, for sure, without going into deeper commentary there. So very refreshing for me. I appreciate it. I expect 50% or so of all future guests to be engineers, since you usually are the person who tracks them down. No, I don't. Well, no, I don't want to leave out I don't want to leave out all the other departments.
We definitely, I think, need to go. We definitely are too design heavy. It's just a matter of,
we need more audio, we need more art.
Yeah.
But we've had some good ones this year already, with that. So,
I think even production too. I think that would be interesting, to get that perspective. There's every discipline.
Yeah.
Be good to get on. For sure.
Yeah. I don't know. Have we ever had an animator?
We had Bogan on, right? Didn't we?
Well, that's right. We had it for Republic Commando.
Yeah, and I feel like maybe we're blanking on another, but rarely.
Yeah, very unusual for us. So that's definitely.
The other thing is we could also target games that we know people who worked on them. So preemptively.
That'd be another way to go.
Yeah. We want to get this person on.
Has it really been 6 games in a row from LucasArts? That's strange.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh boy. But anyway, I mean, it's it was great to we didn't even turn back around and talk more about Mark K. Hutchinson with him, but he did mention him, and of course I know we mentioned at some point the transition from the morph ball back into the helmet being so good. Of course that was Mark,
right? That's a big deal. That's a huge really deal. Hard. And it ended up every time I did
it, I was like, that's really just unbelievable that works.
Yeah.
Every time I saw it, and you see it a lot.
I would even say it probably became a model, or at least inspiration for a lot of FPSs after that did some of that. Yeah. We talked about it some with Halo, right? Because of vehicular, right?
Of course, yeah.
Where you swap, and both of those games were sort of, and it's funny that he told that story from Mark, because both of those games were very much like, they did what? What did they do? Why did they? No, that's too hard. And why would they do that? But then it ends up being a revelation in both cases. So yeah, that was a great story. He had a lot of great stories there. And I know it was super dumb for me to nerd out about that, but something about the way that he described the systemic approach to how they gave, what pieces they gave designers to work with. And I'm thinking back, playing through the game again, in fast forward, and I'm like, whether they, he was describing it as a way to kind of give constraints. It ended up really becoming a silver bullet, or a sole holy grail for the polishing. But I still think, however intentional they were, it's critical for a Metroid game.
Yeah.
That's what Metroid's built on. It's built on a set of rules and systems that and you find ways to use,
Yeah.
It just makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Every game should be built that way. I'm serious. Scripting, I think that we talk about this at work a lot. Giving people complete power and control is not the way to do it.
No,
everyone thinks they want more control.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah,
Believe me.
Yeah, I know. And I don't mean
you're preaching
our,
to a choir here. So
I know. I don't mean even our work today. I just mean we've talked about it for years, right?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, I've believed it for a long time. I mean, I can remember, talking with Darren about the scripting language that they had in Dark Forces and then in Outlaws, and the elevators off to the side. I think Matt Tadaishi talked about it. Like you had this. Basically, you made your own state machine out of elevators, right? And it's so limited, right? And it's like, yeah, but you can't break it. Like, all you can do is say send it up to this level, and it's going to trigger something when it gets there, and that's all you got. Have fun, And it's just
on the flip side of that, not to get into the weeds or any skeletons or anything, but on the Indiana Jones game that I worked on, to Jack's point, he talked about this actually off air, I think, but to Jack's point on, because we basically had a sequel version,
right, a sequel
iteration on from Jedi Knight, so it was the next iteration of that. But from a production standpoint, they relied on designers to do more of the heavy lifting in scripts to accomplish goals that they shouldn't have. Right. And then, you and I know that the N64 port did some different things to solve some of those same problems that were hand done
right
in the PC version, and the N64 version is a much better game for it.
Right.
In my opinion, plays better, and it's just because it has more systemic things going on that wasn't just hand crafted, because it shouldn't have been. But designers want control, but also sometimes designers are taken advantage of because they say, "Well, just script that." It's like, well, no, this should not be scripted. That's how we're going to ship, So
yeah. No, I agree. It is I obviously have worked places where designers do a lot of the things that he talks about in terms of spreading out what they do and using them to do multiple things. Talking about just using a CSV file, Excel spreadsheet to describe behavior. I mean, what it does mean, and just thinking about that as a lens on Japanese games, like I see it. I'm like, of course, that's what it is. Especially Nintendo, but not just Nintendo. And, so it's just, there's just something really, really, it is really powerful. And we say it all the time that constraints inspire creativity. And, this is an example of constraints. You've got to keep 60. So we want to have these different vision modes. How are we going to do that? Like we're not going to drop 60 to do it. So the solution is not the easy solution of just like, well, when we're in this mode, it'd be okay to be slower, or whatever, It's like, no, you got to figure out what you're going to take out, and using the fog and making that basically a feature of that X-ray visor, like makes that feel really claustrophobic and dangerous in a great way. Right. So there's just, there are benefits that come in, from that, and it makes a thing distinct.
Or the scan mode where...
Yeah, the scan mode with no weapon.
It's like, that's like, imagine if you could still have your weapon up, you'd just be in scan mode the whole game, right? And so
exactly.
The design decision and the tech decision go hand in hand there.
Yeah, and it introduces great tension that improves the game, because of course there's this like, I want to scan everything, because I'm a completionist gamer. Of course, we miss the space boots.
Jeez, I just will never... forgive myself.
I'm just going to bring it up whenever we miss something obvious about anything. We'll be in a meeting and we'll be like, "Why didn't we think of this?" And I'm like, "Tim, it's just the space boots all over again."
Yeah. Oh boy.
So, anyway, well, it was great, great eating the elephant with Jack, and I'm glad we had him on.
You got him with that one.
Yeah, he was not prepared for that. Well, his wife's a vegetarian, so he's not used to eating elephant, but yeah, that's something I thought of last week when we had the email about burnout and working on your game, and it's like, just got to treat it like eating an elephant, just one bite at a time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thanks again to Jack, and thanks to who'd you say it was?
Kynan Pearson. Yeah,
Kynan Pearson. Thanks to Kynan Pearson for hooking us up. We are not doing any email or reviews or anything like that this week. We'll catch up on our email next week. We've got a few, but you can send those to devgameclub@gmail.com. And, of course, send us reviews wherever. And if we get to them from Apple, then great. We'll read them. Otherwise, maybe point us there and let us know that they're there, and we'll go track them down. Or you can just mail them in. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or at devgameclub on Twitter, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end, but I don't know. I think we're migrating.
Who knows how long it'll be there. We don't talk about Twitch. What's Twitch?
Yeah.
But we do have a Discord, so you should check that out. There's a link in the show notes with an invite. It's still growing, still having people come by. It's really fun. You know, it feels like we have another few people trickle in every week, so we're just steadily growing.
Amazing.
A lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo, setting up that Discord and some of his administration, and our merch store, which you can find, I guess in the Twitch link somewhere.
There's a whole channel for it, I think.
At me. Yeah, there's a whole channel
Discord.
with stuff in the Discord, so you can probably find it there as well. Anyway, that's all by Mark Garcia. Thanks so much, Mark. We appreciate all your work. Have fun diving into your backlog of Metroidvanias this week, and good night.
Good night.